Here we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Corzine with SimpleFringe, and I'm joined here today with Jenny Clark from Solvability. Hi, Jenny. How are you doing today?
Terrific, Matt. I'm so excited to talk more about SCA.
Yeah, who knew we would have seven, probably more than seven topics to cover between the two of us, but I'm excited to jump into this third one. Today, we're going to continue on where we left off last week, which is on how to build a compliant labor rate on an SCA contract. And I love to start off these with kind of a hypothetical to put ourselves in the shoes of a contractor bidding on an SCA contract. So in that scenario, the wage determination would be part of the solicitation. So the contractor would know the locations where the work is going to be performed. They would know for each location the wage determination that would apply. As we talked about last week, that wage determination is going to include the wage rates for each job classification and the health and welfare rate that they have to provide to the employees. But what we want to dig into today is the different components to build into this labor rate. And Jenny, I'm hoping, based on your experience and way beyond the compliance side of contracting, you can kind of start walking us through this, and I'll jump in on the SCA pieces.
Well, that'll be great, Matt, because I always like to talk about math, and that's what pricing is. If
Yeah.
you don't know the math, you're going to make a mistake and maybe lose money where you should have bid a different one, but you also want to know that you're competitively priced. So understanding these really makes a big difference. Plus, when you're hiring those SCA employees, when you win the contract, you want to make sure that you understand exactly how they need to be paid and everything's compliant.
Mhm.
So when we're looking at this chart, I like the way that on the left-hand side, you're showing that we're starting from a floor down at the bottom and going up to the elements. The first one being the direct labor pay rate,
Mhm.
then the health and welfare or cash in lieu obligation for the Service Contract Act. Then we're going to add some fringe, some overhead, some G&A, some fee and profit. And I'll explain those here as we go along just a minute. So floor one is the wage determined minimum wage. And you said it's on Schedule J in the solicitation, and it lists minimum wages by labor category, and your direct labor rate can't go below that number. If you don't mind, can you kind of explain to them what a wage determination looks like? I've seen it as a list of labor categories and dollars next to it.
Yeah, yeah, I'd be happy to. So the actual wage determination looks like something printed from one of those dot matrix printers from the 1980s. So it's very distinctive um, in terms of listing, most importantly, the location to which it applies, right? So sometimes a location is a county, sometimes a location is a region. Again, the solicitation should be very clear on where the work is going to be performed. And from that, you would know the wage determinations that apply. The wage determinations are many, many pages long because they list every single possible job classification for any given SCA contract. And this is really important because each job classification has its own required minimum wage rate. Again, wage rate is very different from the health and welfare rate, which we'll talk about in a second. And that wage rate is the minimum that the contractor must pay to the employees working on that SCA contract. I will just note as a sidebar, sometimes when contractors ultimately win an SCA contract, they realize that there's a type of position that doesn't appear on the wage determination. And there's a special process that contractors have to go through. It's called the conformance process to
I knew it.
effectively, yep, you got it. You have to go to the DOL, explain why this different or hybrid type of position is necessary for the contract, propose a wage rate that goes with that classification, and then typically it gets approved. But it's very important that you do that proactively when you win the contract and not retroactively seeking approval later. So just a sidebar. But in most cases, you're going to have employees fitting neatly into different job classifications, and from there you'll have the minimum wages that you have uh, to pay them.
And as you're talking about that, I'm remembering those listings that I would see that would have a courier or electronic technician, one, two, and three different
Mhm.
categories like that. And each
Yep.
one has its different rate. And when you talk about conforming those labor categories or wage determination rates, you have to come up with a blend and say how you came up with that dollar value to get it approved. So floor number one is our wage
Mhm.
determined minimum wage. And
Mhm.
you're also saying you can't just say if it says $22 an hour, you can't say, well, this person makes 21.50, that's close enough, can you?
No, you can't. You can, of course, pay more than the minimum wage rate, but and there are times where contractors certainly feel the need to do that in order to recruit and retain employees. But that's more of a competitive and profitability consideration if they decide to go above and beyond that minimum wage rate.
Okay, so let's talk about floor number two. That is the SCA H&W obligation. And I usually see it in payroll systems as cash in lieu or
Mhm.
CFB, cash in lieu of fringe benefits, because I'm always looking at payroll codes.
Yep.
And you were pointing out that it's 555, but there's an executive order 13706,
Mhm.
which required 56 hours of sick leave per year. And so that really makes it that it's going to be $5.09 an hour because don't all contracts that are now active include that?
Uh,
Okay.
effectively, yes. In fact, there will be a day where that higher fringe rate will not even apply to any contracts, and the DOL will no longer have to publish we'll call it the higher that non-executive order 13706. But for today, it's a little bit confusing. On a wage determination, you will see two health and welfare rates. You'll see the typically the 555 and the 509, but in 99% plus of the contracts, it's the $5.09 per hour health and welfare rate that will apply to the contract.
Okay. And so the next part of it is so you got on there, think about their paycheck that you're going to put in a pay rate.
Mhm.
You'll put in the pay rate you've agreed with the employee to pay, and you want to make sure it's above that floor one.
Mhm.
You can always pay more. And then you'll have the health and welfare as the next element. And the sequence is exactly what you've got here. The right build sequence is you pull the wage determination, you figure out what the minimum pay rate is, and you add the health and welfare, which is typically going to be $5.09 an hour. The next piece that we have to take into account on a pricing standpoint is going to be adding fringe, which is over and above the $5.09 an hour, your overhead and your G&A on top.
Mhm.
And I'll spend just a minute explaining what those terms mean. And there's a certain amount of interpretation going on here. So this isn't like it's always this way. It's we want to give you an understanding of the layers.
Yep.
So every company has a fringe benefit package for what they consider their corporate employees. And what they have to be able to show is that we're paying the employee that is an SCA employee a combination of either the cash in lieu, the $5.09, or we're applying some of that money toward their fringe.
Mhm.
Because there are companies that really say, we got a great fringe package, and we work with our employees and say, how about we take that $5.09 an hour and apply it toward these benefits that are offered to you under our corporate benefit plan? And they give employees choices on what they want. And that's very common practice. But we have to show that we did that correctly when we do. So you've also got the fringe also includes holiday pay.
Mhm.
Your vacation pay, your paid time off is actually specified according to seniority inside the wage determination. And all of those things are part of fringe. So there's a certain amount of finesse those to figure out what part of fringe still needs to be applied after you've done the H&W. Overhead is the cost of running the technical side of the business. So tools, equip or tools, supervision, things that the people that are working on contract need to have to do their
Mhm.
job. And so with SCA contracts, it's mostly if there were things that they needed to do their job that the employer provided. G&A is the corporate, the back office, the headquarters kind of cost, the cost of running the business. And so that's your accounting, human resources, executive leadership, those activities, professional fees, consulting, things like that. And on top of that is fee or profit. And that's what, when you're doing the pricing on all these activities, you figure out what the direct labor costs are, you figure out what the health and welfare is, you determine what portion of fringe needs to be applied. If there's overhead and G&A, which there will be, you do those calculations. You come up to total cost, and then the last element is what you want to charge for profit. It depends on what kind of contract you're working with. If it's a cost plus contract, you'll usually have some guidance on what kind of fee percentage it'll be. 6 to 8% is typical. If it's a fixed price or time and material, which are less common with SCA, but they do happen, then you have to decide how much your total price is going to be and do it that way. So we built the compliance floor first, and we built the profit on top of it. So Matt, what else do you want to add to that before we keep going?
Yeah, I was thinking about the jumping from that SCA health and welfare obligation section into that fringe section, specifically the benefits. The challenge for many contractors is, again, if you're providing all of the health and welfare obligation as cash or cash in lieu, it's relatively straightforward, right? You put it on the pay stub on a separate earnings code. It's more expensive, right? Because you as the employer are paying all the payroll taxes on that, on those wages. But employees certainly tend to appreciate seeing that money in their pay stub. But at the same time, if you're providing benefits, which most contractors are, the amount that you as the employer are paying towards those benefits can count towards your fringe obligation. And if you're in a situation where you are effectively giving employees part of the health and welfare as cash in lieu because they are electing benefits, that's where the calculations can get complicated. One, because the hours that the employees work and thus the obligation is changing from pay period to pay period. And two, benefit elections change at least typically once a year, sometimes throughout the year. And so you really need a good system to be able to manage that, improve compliance reliably. A lot of contractors do this in spreadsheets in a very manual, labor intensive, and I would argue sometimes error prone way. We've built SimpleFringe as the solution to the spreadsheet, if you will, a system that allows contractors to use a standardized approach for doing this analysis, determining exactly which employees are under compliant and need that cash in lieu and the exact amount that they need. So again, if you're a contractor that's providing benefits and then cash as the true up or the make the employee whole, that's just where the calculation requires a lot of attention and accuracy, because that reporting is the first thing that the Department of Labor will ask for in the event of a DOL investigation. They will say they expect contractors to be tracking this correctly and consistently on their own. And when you get a DOL investigation request, you want to be able to provide those records quickly without having to scramble and pull a bunch of things together. It's not a good look to the DOL if it's taking you a while to provide the reports that really you should already have on in your records.
Well, I think you're making a very good point, having seen these spreadsheets.
Mhm.
And so when I have worked with people that had Service Contract Act, it was always a question, does the human resources group create that reporting and do the
Mhm.
tracking, or does somebody in the payroll department or accounting do that? And
Yeah.
because human resources view is different from an accounting view, sometimes there was conflict over how it should be calculated. On the other
Mhm.
hand, when there's a problem with the payroll, it's usually the human resources people that get the call because they're the ones that have to respond to employee requests and information. And we want to make sure that whoever is interacting with the employees is well informed and can state clearly exactly what's going on. But I think about that those spreadsheets and what made them complicated, because it seems really simple at the beginning. You take let's talk about the biggest component would be health insurance. The employee
Mhm.
says, yes, I'd like to have health insurance. I'd like it to go toward my health insurance because that would be something I need for myself and my family. And so the human resources would figure out, okay, how much money would the health and welfare contribute each month toward the payment of the employee deduction, and make it work that way.
Mhm.
And once they've met the deduction, they don't want to take any extra money. Well, here's the thing. Sometimes there will be 160 hours in a month. Sometimes there will be, um, it depends on your payroll cycle, biweekly or semi-monthly,
Right.
or is it, however weekly, however you do it. Well, benefits are calculated monthly, and these are biweekly transactions. So it makes it complicated to remember how to do that. The other thing that I would run into is when I would look at the calculations being performed, somebody just took a spreadsheet that had been passed to them and passed to them and passed to them,
Mm.
and they really didn't know what it was supposed to be, and they really didn't have an understanding of what needed to be updated on a regular basis to make sure it was accurate. So that's where SimpleFringe makes it simple, where right now it's kind of complicated.
Yeah, I mean, you make a good point. Where I've seen contractors get into trouble, if you will, is they have a spreadsheet, and let's just be generous and assume the spreadsheet is the math ultimately is correct. But if it's complicated to follow, if you need an instruction manual of how the calculations are working, that's going to present a problem during a DOL audit because again, you want to be able to hand something over to the DOL that is self-explanatory, that does not require a phone call to walk through the calculations and so on. And you want to get to that understanding with the DOL investigator as soon as possible. And the more complicated your spreadsheet is, the harder it is for them to get to that um, feeling of reassurance that the math is right and that you're compliant. So again, there's lots of ways to do this. I'm not saying any are right or wrong or in the middle, but I will just say the more streamlined and easy to follow the reporting is, the better off your DOL investigation will go. Because I can promise you, the DOL investigator, as much as sometimes we like to think that they are just on a hunt to find something wrong. My experience is that really, of course, if there's something wrong, they're going to dig into it and ask lots more questions. But most of the investigations, are not that complicated if they don't have to be. And if you can provide some streamlined, simple information, the DOL investigator is happy to, close the case and move on to the next thing, versus trying to, dig, 7 layers down to find some, 5 cent under, variance amount that you might have missed.
Well, I think you make a good point about that. They're looking for, if they see a standard report and they can point to this is the system that we use to do it, and you've got a lot better way to prove those things just running reports.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
last thing you put down here is if the floor pushes your rate too high. And I think we're talking about that from a pricing standpoint. You wrote that's a pricing signal, not a compliance problem to work around. We don't want to shave fringe to try to make your price the right one. You want to make sure all the
Mhm.
fringes are covered, all the health and welfare obligation is covered. So you're not into a gap that gives you a liability for back pay. Because making corrections for pay, that's a lot of trouble to do it. It upsets employees. It makes
Mhm.
extra pay. Nobody really wants to do it. But you do need to take a look at what the total cost is going to be when you create your billing rate and know where you end up. Matt, I think that what you've created here is a way to solve a particular problem for groups of people that are serving the government with providing qualified employees on these service contract acts. And we want to make sure the government's getting their full service, but we got a lot of paperwork to do. And SimpleFringe makes it easier.
Yeah, well, we think so, and yeah, I'm aware that SCA contracts are hyper competitive, and that the margins on these contracts are lower than most contractors would like. But that's, candidly just the nature of the business right now. And so understanding, making a strategic decision to lower your fee or profit, say in your proposal from 12% to 8%, is very different than, as you alluded to, Jenny, um, mistakenly kind of cutting into the health and welfare rate or the minimum wages that you have to pay those employees. Again, there's lots of reasons to go into strategic pricing and lower profit margins, but at the end of the day, you just cannot cut into that health and welfare and the wage rates without getting into trouble.
Well, that's a very good point. And on all these contracts, everything that you've got is labor. You're selling labor, you're providing employees to do the job and making sure they do it well, and making sure that you've got the compliance portion is so important, so that you're running your company to serve that government contract, and
Yeah,
you're also getting the fee that you feel like is appropriate. But you're right, the margins are skinny.
yeah, always, always. Well, Jenny, I think we've covered everything here on this visual today. Anything else to add before we wrap up?
No, I think you're on the right track with SimpleFringe and helping to serve those people that have Service Contract Act to make sure they've got the reporting they need to back up what they're paying people.
Well, thank you. And just as a reminder, again, my name is Matt Corzine with SimpleFringe. You can find us at simplefringe.com. And Jenny, you want to tell people how to find you?
Yeah, I'm Jenny W. Clark if you're doing a search. And
Mhm.
my company is Solvability. My website is solvability.com. And if you have questions, you're welcome to reach out to me.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Jenny. I'm looking forward to talking next time.
Thank you.